time, okay, sort of Heideggerian phenomenology. And then in response to that, you see, what is God? Well, if the existential condition is one of ultimate concern, then God is the object of our ultimate concern. Phenomenologically, we see the intentionality in ultimate concern. Well, what is the object then for which we're leaning? Well, that's what we call God, you see. So in effect, his is an argument from religious experience. Religious experience, described phenomenologically, points to God. Yes. So a phenomenology of religious consciousness in that sense. Tillich's work, accordingly. Gadamer. Okay, and this is where we get to the mainstream of contemporary hermeneutical thought. And if you want to tap into its development up through Gadamer, not after Gadamer, but up through Gadamer, take a look at the book by Richard Palmer, called Hermeneutics. It's in the library. Palmer teaches, I think it's at McMurray College downstate here in Illinois. And it's a good book which goes back to people like Schleiermacher and traces the development of hermeneutical theory up to the 1970s. Gadamer is still alive. In fact, most of you remember Bruce Benson, who was with us. He's been studying with Gadamer in doing his dissertation in Germany. Though apparently Gadamer is beginning to get beyond even that sort of thing. All right, then, what about this phenomenological hermeneutic? Well, back up in your thinking to the Enlightenment, the 18th century. There the emphasis, of course, was on the objectivity of our knowledge and understanding. Not only of physical objects, but also of texts, written material, other people's actions. The objectivity of understanding. So interpretation is a purely objective activity in which one examines the objective data and draws logical conclusions. Kind of an inductive method. By the time you get past Kant and the Copernican revolution, all that changes. Obviously, the Copernican revolution is going to say we bring our own grids to reading, to interpreting anything. And that becomes increasingly evident. The initial step, I think, following Kant could be Schleiermacher, who you remember was one of those German idealists around the time of Hegel. Friedrich Schleiermacher, theologian. Inasmuch as we impose our subjective grids on what we think and do, Schleiermacher gets interested in the subjective intention of the author. That is to say, he's not thinking of the grid that the reader brings, but rather of the subjective grid of the author. So for Schleiermacher, the function of any interpretation, any hermeneutic, is to get behind the text that the author has written and to discover the author's own intention. Now, read intention there in the sense of intentionality. Direction. Telos. What is it that he is pointing towards, moving towards? Because Schleiermacher, being a monistic idealist, thinks that there is one overall creative spirit, all-encompassing divine spirit, that is immanent within every individual. This is that immanentistic theology, that panentheism, you see. And so this creative divine spirit that runs through all things, like Hegel's absolute, you see, is what is manifest in the author's intention, in the author's subjectivity. So in getting at the intention of the author, you are getting at the overall intention of the divine spirit. You see. And in that sense, there's something of inspiration in everything that's written. Not just religious texts. But in any case, his emphasis is on getting at the subjective grid of the author, the subjective intention. That phrase, authorial intention, has often been picked up out of context and used by Enlightenment-type interpreters. You hear it used a lot among evangelicals, who are trying by objective means to understand what the author meant by his language. Now, in that sense, meaning, what the language means, what are you trying to say, is not the same as intentionality in Schleiermacher's sense. You see, where intentionality is a much more pervasive direction in things working out in the course of history. So watch the phrase authorial intention, which has a different use than Schleiermacher's notion of the intention of the author. But Schleiermacher, as I say, is simply interested in the subjectivity of the author because of his overall idealism, an unconscious intentionality on part of the author very often. But the further thing which comes into play in this development is, of course, Husserl with his doctrine of intentionality, so that what reading or giving attention to anything is a meaning constituting act. A meaning constitutive act. So in the act of reading, trying to interpret something, what I'm doing is bringing my meaning to that and making it for me. You see, the meaning constitutive act. The subjectivity of the reader gets stronger until in Heidegger, you recall, understanding itself is a way of being in the world. It's a mode of design. So that how I understand something is simply an expression of my subjective grid, of my intentionality. And so Heidegger is not doing a hermeneutic of any objective text, but a hermeneutic of the reader. Yes. Of my design. Well, what you get then, arising out of this quite plainly, is the recognition that there is subjective intentionality on the part of both writer and reader, both the author and the interpreter. And so you have two subjectivities. And interpretation then becomes very much like an interpersonal dynamic. An I-thou relationship, in which each is trying to understand the other. The thing is, however, that in interpreting historical materials, there is a great big gap. There's a time gap. So that the mutual understanding is significantly harder to achieve. But the procedure that Gadamer proposes is essentially the same. There must be a dialogue. Dialogue is a two-way street, which provides an encounter between the two subjectivities, between the two horizons, if you like, the two perspectives. So that in practice what happens is that you come to some text, asking questions of the text out of your own subjective grid, which he calls a pre-understanding. Your pre-understanding, you see, a subjective grid is a pre-understanding. Sometimes that is translated a prejudice, except that he spells it, or the translator spells it without the hyphen, so that it looks like prejudice. What is a prejudice? It's a prejudgment. What is a prejudgment but a pre-understanding? What is a pre-understanding but subjective intentionality? You see? So you bring your prejudgment, your pre-perception of what is being said to the text, and in dialogue with the text, that is to say, with the author, in dialogue with the text, you find that your questions become reshaped, recast. Your understanding gets modified. And as the dialogue continues, so the two horizons begin to come closer, the one to the other. Questioning the text answering and changing the questions, and I come again, and it answers again, as it were. And as you live with the text, interacting with the text, so the historical gap is narrowed and the two horizons begin to merge. Now, you'll notice that that's essentially the way it is with interpersonal relationships. You see, if you're not sure, if you understand what somebody is thinking or where they're coming from, you pose a question, is this what you're saying? And in the light of the response, you say, well, do you mean this? And then as the dialogue continues, oh, I see, so you mean this? Well, not quite, but you see, and on it goes, and the horizons begin to meet. Now, what makes this possible is that the two subjectivities share a common history, a common cultural tradition that is carried by a common language.